America's foreign policy is a big deal. It's not just about diplomacy or international relations, it's about the very fabric of global interactions. The decisions made in Washington, D.C. ripple outwards, affecting economies, governments, and the lives of ordinary people around the world. It's about how the U.S. interacts with other countries. These interactions can range from trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations to military alliances and humanitarian aid. Each of these actions has far-reaching consequences, shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that are often complex and multifaceted. And let's be honest, it throws its weight around quite a bit. The U.S., with its vast economic and military resources, often plays a dominant role on the world stage. This influence can be seen in various forms, from military bases scattered across the globe, to its significant contributions to international organizations like the United Nations and NATO. From economic aid to military interventions, the U.S. has a long history of shaping the world according to its interests. This can be seen in its involvement in conflicts, its efforts to promote democracy, and its initiatives to provide humanitarian assistance. However, these actions are not without controversy, and often spark debates about the true motives behind them. But what does this mean for developing countries? These nations often find themselves at the receiving end of U.S. foreign policy decisions. Whether it's through economic aid packages, military support, or diplomatic pressure, the impact on their societies can be profound and lasting. Well, that's what we're here to unpack. Understanding the nuances of U.S. foreign policy and its effects on developing countries requires a deep dive into history, economics, and international relations. It's a complex web of actions and reactions where every decision can have multiple outcomes. It's easy to think of foreign policy as something distant and academic. After all, it's often discussed in terms of treaties, sanctions, and diplomatic cables. But the reality is far more tangible and immediate. It has a very real impact on people's lives. From the price of goods in local markets to the stability of governments, U.S. foreign policy decisions can alter the daily lives of millions. For many, these decisions can mean the difference between peace and conflict, prosperity and poverty. When the U.S. makes a decision, it sends ripples across the globe. These ripples can affect global financial markets, international trade, and even the political stability of entire regions. The interconnectedness of today's world means that no country is an island, and the actions of one can have far-reaching consequences for many. And more often than not, it's the developing world that feels the tremors most acutely. These countries, with their often fragile economies and political systems, are particularly vulnerable to external shocks. Whether it's a sudden change in trade policy or a military intervention, the effects can be devastating. This isn't about pointing fingers or demonizing anyone, it's about understanding the complexities of international relations and the responsibilities that come with power. The goal is to foster a more informed and nuanced discussion about the role of the U.S. in the world. It's about understanding how we got here and, more importantly, where we go from here. By looking at the past, we can gain insights into the present and make more informed decisions for the future. History is filled with lessons that can guide us, if we're willing to learn from them. So, buckle up as we delve into the complex and often unsettling world of U.S. foreign policy and its impact on the developing world. We'll explore the stories, the data, and the human experiences that make this topic so vital and compelling. Join us on this journey to better understand the forces that shape our world and the lives of those within it. To understand the present, we need to look at the past. The events that shape our current world are deeply rooted in the historical context of the 20th century. The Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, set the stage for many of the conflicts and policies we see today. This era was marked by a constant struggle for power and influence, not just between the two superpowers, but also within the developing nations that became their battlegrounds. The U.S. has a long history of involvement in developing countries, particularly during the Cold War. This involvement was often justified under the guise of protecting democracy and freedom, but the reality was far more complex. The U.S. sought to expand its influence and counter the spread of communism, often through covert operations and military interventions. These actions had profound and lasting impacts on the political and social landscapes of these nations. This was a time of intense rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. Both nations were locked in a battle for global supremacy, each trying to outdo the other in terms of military might, technological advancements, and ideological influence. Propaganda played a significant role in shaping public perception and rallying support for their respective causes. The fear of nuclear war loomed large, influencing policies and decisions on both sides. Both superpowers vied for influence across the globe, often using developing countries as pawns in their geopolitical chess game. These proxy wars were fought in various regions, from Southeast Asia to Latin America, and Africa to the Middle East. The local populations bore the brunt of these conflicts, suffering from violence, displacement, and economic instability. The superpowers provided support to their chosen allies, further fueling the conflicts and deepening the divisions within these societies. The US often backed regimes that were, shall we say, less than democratic. These alliances were formed out of strategic necessity rather than ideological alignment. Dictators and authoritarian leaders were seen as reliable partners in the fight against communism, even if their methods were brutal and oppressive. This support often came in the form of military aid, economic assistance, and political backing, enabling these regimes to maintain their grip on power. Why? Because they were seen as a bulwark against the spread of communism. The fear of a domino effect, where one country after another would fall to communism, drove US foreign policy decisions. This led to a series of interventions and support for anti-communist movements around the world. The goal was to contain the spread of communism and protect US interests, but the consequences were often devastating for the local populations. The logic was simple, if brutal. Better a dictator in our pocket than a communist at our doorstep. This pragmatic approach prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability and human rights. The alliances formed during this period had lasting repercussions, contributing to ongoing conflicts and instability in many regions. The legacy of these policies is still felt today, as many of the same issues and power dynamics continue to shape global politics. The end of the Cold War didn't exactly usher in an era of peace and harmony. While the collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of a significant chapter in history, it also left a power vacuum and a host of unresolved conflicts. The world entered a new phase of uncertainty, with old alliances shifting and new threats emerging. The promise of a new world order was quickly overshadowed by regional conflicts, ethnic tensions, and the rise of new global challenges. The war on terror became the new justification for intervention. The attacks of September 11, 2001 fundamentally changed the global security landscape. The US launched a series of military campaigns aimed at dismantling terrorist networks and preventing future attacks. This new era of intervention was characterized by a focus on counter-terrorism, with significant resources and attention directed towards the Middle East and South Asia. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy was once again used to justify these actions, but the outcomes were often complex and controversial. From Afghanistan to Iraq, the US poured troops and resources into countries grappling with instability and conflict, often leaving behind more chaos than they found. These interventions have had far-reaching consequences, affecting not only the regions directly involved but also the broader international community. The legacy of these actions continues to shape global politics, as nations grapple with the challenges of terrorism, extremism, and the quest for stability in an increasingly interconnected world. Economic aid can be a powerful tool for development. When used effectively, it can help lift people out of poverty, improve infrastructure, and promote economic growth. But here's the catch. US aid often comes with strings attached. These strings can take many forms. It might be pressure to adopt certain economic policies like privatization or deregulation, or it could be demands for political alignment, such as voting with the US at the UN. This conditional aid can leave developing countries beholden to US interests, limiting their autonomy and sovereignty. It's like offering a helping hand, but only if the recipient agrees to dance to your tune. Section 4. Flexing military muscle interventions and their consequences. The US military is a global behemoth. It has bases and troops stationed all over the world, and it's not afraid to use them. From full-scale invasions to drone strikes, US military intervention has become a defining feature of the post-Cold War era. But these interventions often come at a steep price. They can lead to civilian casualties, destabilize entire regions, and create power vacuums that fuel extremism and violence. And let's not forget the devastating human cost, the millions displaced from their homes, the shattered families, and the psychological scars that linger long after the bombs have stopped falling. Section 5, Case Study, a look at Latin America. Let's bring this home with a concrete example. Latin America. This region, rich in culture, history, and natural resources, has long been a focal point of U.S. foreign policy. The influence of the United States in Latin America is profound and multifaceted, spanning economic, political, and military dimensions. This region has long been considered America's backyard, and U.S. influence there is undeniable. From the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, which asserted U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere, to the Cold War era, the U.S. has consistently sought to shape the political landscape of Latin America to align with its own interests. From propping up dictators to orchestrating coups, the U.S. has a long and troubled history in the region. Take Chile, for example. The U.S. has often justified its interventions as necessary to combat communism or to promote democracy, but the outcomes have frequently been far from democratic or peaceful. In 1973, the U.S. supported a military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Allende's government had pursued socialist policies that were seen as a threat to U.S. interests in the region. The coup led to a period of intense violence and repression. The result? A brutal dictatorship led by Augusto Pinochet, responsible for widespread human rights abuses. Thousands were tortured, killed, or disappeared during his regime. The U.S.'s role in supporting Pinochet's rise to power remains a dark chapter in its foreign policy history. Or consider Nicaragua, where the U.S. funded and armed the Contras, a right-wing rebel group that terrorized the country in the 1980s. The Contras were fighting against the Sandinista government, which had come to power after overthrowing the U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship. The conflict resulted in significant loss of life and widespread suffering. These are just two examples of the devastating consequences of U.S. intervention in Latin America. The legacy of these actions is still felt today, as many countries in the region continue to grapple with political instability, economic challenges, and social unrest. And while the Cold War may be over, the legacy of U.S. involvement continues to cast a long shadow over the region. The influence of the United States in Latin America remains a contentious issue, with ongoing debates about sovereignty, economic dependency, and the right to self-determination. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone looking to grasp the complexities of U.S.-Latin American relations today.